I knew something was wrong the moment I found that life insurance policy with my forged signature. $1 million if I died suddenly, not peacefully in my sleep. Then my son Daniel handed me water that evening, smiling the same smile he'd had since childhood. For 30 years, I'd given him everything. I worked extra shifts when he needed braces. I sold my jewelry to pay for his college. After his father died, I gave Daniel my savings to start his business. Now, as I stared at that glass, I remembered the wilted plants, his late-night visits, his growing insistence that I drink what he prepared, his debts and new, questionable friends. My son thought I was a helpless old woman, worth more dead than alive, but he never really knew me. I wouldn't drink the bitter water he offered. Instead, I made my own move first. Margaret Finch enjoyed her quiet life in the small two-bedroom house she'd owned for over 40 years. Since Walter passed away 5 years ago, she'd settled into comfortable routines, tending her garden, hosting her weekly book club, and meeting her son Daniel for dinner every Sunday. At 68, she had few complaints. Her arthritis flared occasionally, but her mind remained sharp as ever, something she prided herself on. Today was Tuesday, her designated day for organizing paperwork and paying bills. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by neatly arranged stacks of envelopes and folders. She kept meticulous records, another point of pride. Walter had always teased her about her filing system, but she knew he'd appreciated her orderliness. As she sorted through a pile of mail, something caught her eye. A thick envelope addressed to Daniel had been delivered to her house by mistake. She set it aside to give to him at their next dinner. Then she noticed the return address, Meridian Life Insurance Company. Margaret frowned. Daniel had his own insurance through his accounting job. Why would he receive mail from another company? Probably just promotional materials, she reasoned. Still, a nagging feeling made her hesitate. Daniel had been acting strangely lately, more distracted, checking his phone constantly during their visits. Last week, he'd asked oddly specific questions about her health. Before she could reconsider, Margaret slid her finger under the envelope flap. Inside was a policy confirmation letter congratulating Daniel on his new purchase. Margaret scanned the document, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. It was a life insurance policy on her, for $1 million. Her hands trembled as she turned to the second page. There, at the bottom, was her signature authorizing the policy, except it wasn't her signature, not exactly. Someone had copied her distinctive loop on the M, and the way she crossed her "tis," but the strokes were too deliberate, too careful. Margaret's throat tightened. Her son had forged her signature on a life insurance policy that would pay him handsomely if she died unexpectedly. She read the fine print carefully. The policy specifically excluded natural deaths from age-related illness. It only paid out in cases of accidents or unexpected health crises. Heart attacks, strokes, poisoning. Margaret set the paper down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Daniel was just being cautious. Maybe he meant it as a safety net, not something sinister. But why forge her signature? Why not discuss it with her first? She knew Daniel had financial troubles. His divorce 3 years ago had hit him hard, and he'd mentioned struggling with the alimony payments. But was he desperate enough to? She couldn't even finish the thought. Margaret carefully returned the papers to the envelope and sealed it as best she could. She placed it back with the mail, then sat completely still at her kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at nothing. That evening, her doorbell rang at exactly 6:30. Daniel always visited on Tuesdays, bringing takeout and chatting about his week. She'd almost forgotten in her shock. When she opened the door, her son smiled warmly. Under his arm was a bag of Chinese food, her favorite. The familiar scent of General Tissot's chicken wafted toward her. "Hey, Mom. Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Daniel stepped inside, kissing her cheek. His aftershave smelled expensive, more expensive than she knew he could afford. Margaret forced herself to smile back. Lovely. Come in, sweetheart. She watched him more carefully than ever before as he unpacked the food containers on her dining table. Had his smile always seemed that practiced? Was there something calculated in the way he arranged her favorite dishes? I brought something special tonight, Daniel said, pulling a bottle from his bag. Sparkling water with those flavor enhancers you like. Raspberry lemonade. Margaret's mouth went dry. That's thoughtful. As they ate, Daniel chatted about work and friends. Margaret nodded at appropriate intervals, barely tasting her food. Her mind raced. 24 hours ago, she would have sworn on her life that her son loved her deeply. Now she found herself watching his hands as he poured her a glass of the sparkling water. Drink up, Mom. It's good for you to stay hydrated at your age. Margaret stared at the pinkish liquid. Had he added something to it? Or was she being paranoid? I'm not very thirsty right now, she said, pushing the glass slightly away. Maybe later. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed Daniel's face before his smile returned. Sure, no problem. Throughout dinner, he urged her to drink twice more. Each time, Margaret deflected. By the time he prepared to leave, the glass remained untouched. Are you feeling okay, Mom? You seem distracted, Daniel said, hugging her goodbye. Just tired. I had a busy day organizing papers. For a moment, she thought she saw alarm in his eyes. Had he realized the insurance document was delivered to her address? But his expression smoothed quickly. Don't work too hard. I worry about you, you know. After he left, Margaret stared at the glass of water for a long time. Was she being ridiculous? Was her mind playing tricks, making her suspect her own child of something unthinkable? There was only one way to find out. She carried the glass to her back porch, where her prized African violet sat in its decorative pot. Walter had given her the plant on their 40th anniversary, and she kept it alive through meticulous care ever since. With a silent apology to the plant, Margaret poured the sparkling water over its soil. If there was nothing in the water, no harm done. If there was something dangerous, well, better the violet than her. She went to bed that night with her bedroom door locked for the first time in her life. Margaret woke early the next morning, sunlight streaming through her curtains. For a moment, she lay peacefully in bed, her mind blissfully empty. Then yesterday's discovery came flooding back, and a wave of nausea hit her. She barely slept, tossing and turning with horrible thoughts about her only child. She pushed herself out of bed, her joints aching more than usual from tension. She needed coffee and clarity. Perhaps in the light of day, everything would seem less sinister. As she padded down the hallway, Margaret glanced toward the back porch. Something caught her eye, and she stopped abruptly. Her African violet, lush and vibrant yesterday, had collapsed overnight. The once sturdy stems drooped lifelessly over the pot's edge. Every leaf had shriveled and turned a sickly brown. Margaret moved closer, her heart hammering. Plants didn't die like this naturally. Not overnight. Not so completely. She touched one leaf gently, and it crumbled between her fingers. The soil was still damp from the water Daniel had insisted she drink. "Oh God," she whispered, backing away from the dead plant. "Oh God, no." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, hands covering her mouth. There was no denying it now. Her son had tried to poison her. The reality was too horrific to process. Daniel, whom she had nursed through chicken pox and broken bones. Daniel, whose college tuition she'd worked double shifts to pay. Daniel, the only person she had left in the world. A sob escaped her, then another. She cried until her throat ached, until no more tears would come. When she finally stopped, a strange calm settled over her. If Daniel wanted her dead, she would need to be smarter than him. More careful, more strategic. First, she needed proof. She took photos of the dead plant with her phone, documenting the unnaturally rapid decay. Then she carefully transferred some of the soil into a plastic bag, sealing it tightly. It might contain traces of whatever had been in the water. Next, she called Robert Kelly, an old friend who had practiced law before retirement. She'd known Robert since before Daniel was born. He was one of the few people she trusted completely. "Robert, I need your help," she said when he answered. "Something's happened, and I don't know where to turn." "Margaret, you sound upset. What's wrong?" She hesitated. Saying it aloud would make it real. "I think someone is trying to harm me. I need to meet you somewhere private. Today, if possible." 2 hours later, they sat in a quiet corner of a cafe 3 towns over, where no one would recognize them. Margaret had chosen her outfit carefully, nothing her son would expect her to wear. She'd even borrowed her neighbor's car, making an excuse about hers being in the shop. Robert listened without interruption as she laid out the evidence: the forged insurance policy, Daniel's financial troubles, the suspicious water, the dead plant. His face grew increasingly grave. "This is extremely serious, Margaret," he said when she finished. "Have you confronted Daniel?" "No. I'm afraid of what he might do if he knows I suspect him." Robert nodded. "That's wise. We need more evidence before taking any action." He examined the photocopy of the insurance policy she'd brought. "This signature is definitely forged. I can see the hesitation marks where the pen paused." "Can we use that to cancel the policy?" Margaret asked hopefully. "Eventually, yes. But if we alert the insurance company now, Daniel will know you've discovered his plan. You might be in even more danger." Margaret felt cold despite the warm cafe. "What should I do?" "First, we need to confirm what was in that water. I know a private lab that can test the soil sample discreetly." Robert leaned forward. "Meanwhile, you need to be extremely careful. Don't eat or drink anything he gives you. Don't let him know you're suspicious. I've been avoiding food and drinks he offers, but he's getting frustrated. Yesterday, he commented twice about me not drinking the water he brought." "That's concerning?" Robert frowned. "And you mentioned he took out a loan recently." "Yes, though he never told me directly. I overheard him arguing on the phone about repayment terms. He sounded desperate." Robert pulled out his phone. "I have a contact who can look into his finances without alerting him. Let me make a call." While Robert stepped outside to speak privately, Margaret watched people in the cafe. A young mother bounced a baby on her knee. An elderly couple shared a scone, heads bent together in easy companionship. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the nightmare her life had become. When Robert returned, his expression confirmed her worst fears. "Daniel took out a high-interest loan 6 months ago from people you don't want to owe money to. $300,000. He's already missed 2 payments." "300,000?" Margaret gasped. What could he possibly need that much money for? "Gambling debts, according to my source. Daniel's been frequenting underground poker games. He's in deep with some dangerous people." Margaret felt dizzy, and the life insurance would more than cover it. Exactly. $1 million pays off his debt with plenty left over. But why not just ask me for help? I would have sold the house if he was in trouble. Robert took her hand. "The house isn't worth enough, Margaret, and based on what you've told me, he's not thinking rationally anymore. He's desperate and scared." Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "So what do I do now?" "We gather evidence, carefully and methodically. I'll have the soil tested. Meanwhile, you need to act normal but vigilant. Can you do that?" She nodded, though her heart felt like it might break. "I raised him better than this, Robert. This isn't about your parenting, Margaret. Some people make terrible choices when they're cornered." Robert checked his watch. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Somewhere Daniel wouldn't think to look?" "My sister's place in Medford. She's on a cruise, but I have a key." "Good. Stay there for a few days. Say you're visiting friends if he asks. I'll be in touch once I have results from the lab." As they left the cafe, Margaret felt like she was walking in a bad dream. The person she loved most in the world wanted her dead. The child she had dedicated her life to saw her as nothing more than a solution to his financial problems. That night, alone in her sister's guest bedroom, Margaret lay awake watching headlights move across the ceiling. She thought about all the years she'd spent protecting Daniel from harm, teaching him right from wrong. Where had she failed so completely? Her phone buzzed with a text. "Daniel, just checking in. You weren't home when I stopped by. Everything okay?" Margaret stared at the screen. Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. "Visiting my friend Nancy for a few days. Needed a change of scenery. Sorry I forgot to mention it." His reply came seconds later. "No problem. Take care of yourself. Love you." Margaret set down the phone, a chill running through her. "Love you." The words felt like a threat now. Margaret returned to her home after 3 nights at her sister's place. She couldn't hide forever, and staying away too long might make Daniel suspicious. Besides, she needed to face this situation head-on, however painful. She arrived mid-morning, checking every room carefully before settling in. Everything looked untouched, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The air felt different somehow. Robert called as she was unpacking. The lab results came back, he said without preamble. There were traces of ethylene glycol in the soil sample. "What is that?" Margaret asked, sinking onto her bed. "Antifreeze. It's sweet-tasting, mixes well with flavored drinks, and causes kidney failure when ingested. It would look like natural causes in an elderly person, especially one with existing health issues." Margaret closed her eyes, absorbing this final confirmation of her son's intentions. "So I was right." "I'm afraid so. I've contacted an old colleague from the police department, Jim Reeves. He's retired now, but still has connections. He wants to meet you." 2 hours later, Margaret sat across from Jim Reeves in Robert's home office. Jim was a burly man with kind eyes that contrasted with his intimidating build. He listened intently as she recounted her story again. "Your son's made a serious mistake," Jim said when she finished. "But proving attempted murder is tricky. We need more than a dead plant and a forged signature." "What do you suggest?" Margaret asked. "We set a trap. Make him believe his plan is working." Jim leaned forward. "You'll need to play along, act vulnerable, make him think you're an easy target. Can you do that?" Margaret thought of the son who used to crawl into her lap after nightmares, the boy she'd taught to ride a bike, the young man she'd proudly watched graduate college. Now she would have to pretend to be his willing victim. "Yes," she said firmly, "I can do whatever it takes." Over the next week, Margaret embarked on perhaps the most difficult performance of her life. When Daniel visited, she greeted him with the same warmth she always had, giving no hint of her knowledge or fear. "You look tired, Mom," he commented during his Sunday visit. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just a little run down," she replied, deliberately making her voice weaker than normal. "Nothing serious." Daniel's eyes lit up with what she now recognized as anticipation rather than concern. "You should take better care of yourself. Here, I brought you some fresh orange juice. It's got extra vitamin C." Margaret eyed the glass he poured. "That's sweet of you." She pretended to sip the juice while actually letting it wet only her lips. When he wasn't looking, she poured most of it into a potted plant beside her chair. By the end of his visit, she'd managed to empty half the glass without swallowing a drop. "I'll stop by tomorrow to check on you," Daniel said as he left. His gaze lingered on the juice glass with an intensity that made her skin crawl. As soon as he was gone, Margaret carefully transferred the remaining juice into a specimen jar that Jim had provided. Then she dumped the soil from the potted plant, replacing it completely. She couldn't risk any more casualties in her indoor garden. The next day, Daniel arrived with homemade soup. "My special recipe," he said, ladling it into a bowl. "It'll perk you right up." Margaret sat at her kitchen table, hunched slightly, playing the role of a weakening old woman. "I haven't been very hungry lately." "Just try a little," he urged, placing the bowl before her. "For me." She stirred the soup slowly, lifting the spoon to her mouth, but diverting it at the last moment. pretending to eat while the soup dribbled back into the bowl. "Delicious," she murmured. Daniel watched her with the focus of a hawk tracking a field mouse. "Have some more." "Actually, I need to use the restroom," Margaret said, standing unsteadily. "Would you mind refilling my water glass while I'm gone?" In the bathroom, she texted Jim. He brought soup, nearly forced me to eat it, getting more insistent. Jim's reply came quickly. "Get a sample if you can. Be careful." When she returned to the kitchen, Daniel had indeed refilled her water glass. She noticed he'd also moved her soup bowl, which now appeared to have less soup than before. Had he added something while she was gone? "Sorry, dear, I'm still not very hungry," she said, ignoring both the soup and water. A flash of frustration crossed Daniel's face. "Mom, you need to eat to keep up your strength." "I will, just not right now." She feigned a coughing fit. "Maybe later." Daniel stayed longer than usual, hovering around her, repeatedly suggesting she eat or drink. Each time, Margaret found an excuse to avoid consumption. By the time he finally left, both were frustrated, though for entirely different reasons. That night, Margaret woke suddenly from a fitful sleep. Something had disturbed her, a sound she couldn't identify. She lay perfectly still, listening. There it was again, a soft creaking floorboard in the hallway outside her bedroom. Someone was in her house. Margaret reached slowly for her phone on the nightstand, careful not to make any noise. She had Jim's number on speed dial, but before she could press it, her bedroom door eased open. In the dim light filtering through her curtains, she saw Daniel's silhouette. He stood watching her for long moments, so still he might have been a statue. Margaret forced her breathing to remain deep and even, feigning sleep while her heart threatened to burst from her chest. After what seemed like an eternity, Daniel backed out of the room, closing the door silently behind him. Margaret heard the front door open and close a few minutes later. With shaking hands, she called Jim. "He was in my house," she whispered, "watching me sleep." "Did he do anything?" Jim asked, instantly alert despite the late hour. "No, just stood there. I pretended to be asleep." "This is escalating faster than I expected," Jim said grimly. "He's getting impatient. We need to move quickly." The next morning, Margaret met with Jim and Robert at a diner 30 miles from her home. She wore a scarf and sunglasses, though she doubted anyone would recognize her here. "The lab confirmed antifreeze in the orange juice sample," Jim told her, "and we've got a contact at the bank who verified Daniel made an unusual withdrawal the day before he brought you the soup." "So we have evidence," Margaret said. "Some, but not enough for a conviction. We need to catch him in the act." Jim pushed a small device across the table. "This is a recording pen. Looks normal, but captures audio. Keep it with you at all times. And this," Robert added, handing her a small bottle, "is Ipecac syrup. If you're ever forced to consume something he gives you, excuse yourself immediately and take this. It will make you vomit before the poison can be absorbed." Margaret stared at the items before her, tools for trapping her own son. "What's the next step?" Jim's expression was both sad and determined. "We make him think his plan is working. You're going to get very sick, Margaret, but not the way Daniel expects." The next phase of their plan began immediately. Margaret stopped answering Daniel's calls for 24 hours, then finally responded with a weak, raspy voice. "Sorry I missed your calls," she told him. "Been feeling under the weather." "You sound terrible," Daniel said, concern coloring his voice. "Should I come over?" "No need to trouble yourself." Margaret coughed dramatically. "Probably just a cold." "I insist." "Mom, I'll bring dinner." When Daniel arrived that evening, Margaret answered the door in her bathrobe, hair uncombed. She'd applied makeup to make herself look pale and had dark circles smudged beneath her eyes. "Mom," Daniel gasped, "you look awful." "Just tired," she mumbled, shuffling back to her favorite armchair. Daniel watched her closely as he unpacked containers of soup and bread. "Have you seen a doctor?" "It's nothing," Margaret waved dismissively. "Don't fuss." As they ate, Margaret maintained her act, occasionally wincing and pressing a hand to her stomach. She pretended to eat small spoonfuls of soup while actually disposing of most in a napkin on her lap. "I made this special chicken soup just for you," Daniel said, ladling more into her bowl. "It's Grandma's recipe with my own twist." Margaret's recording pen sat in her bathrobe pocket, capturing every word. "That's thoughtful," she murmured, noticing how intently he watched each spoonful that approached her mouth. When Daniel went to the bathroom, Margaret quickly switched soup bowls, replacing hers with an identical one she'd prepared and hidden beneath her chair. She'd take the untouched soup to Jim later for testing. As the evening progressed, she pretended to grow increasingly tired, even dozing off mid-conversation. "Mom, maybe you should get to bed," Daniel suggested. Margaret blinked slowly as if struggling to focus. "Yes, perhaps you're right." As he helped her to her bedroom, she leaned heavily against him, noting the tension in his body. Was it concern or anticipation? "Thanks for checking on me, dear," she said as he tucked her in like she used to do for him as a child. "I'm sure I'll feel better tomorrow." "I hope so, Mom," he replied, his expression unreadable. "Call me if you need anything during the night." After he left, Margaret immediately contacted Jim, delivering the soup sample to him at a predetermined meeting point. "You're doing great," Jim assured her, "but be careful. If he thinks his attempts aren't working, he might try something more drastic." Jim's warning proved accurate. 3 days later, Daniel arrived unannounced, carrying groceries. "I thought I'd make dinner for us," he announced. "You're looking better, but still not yourself." Margaret had indeed begun displaying signs of improvement in their charade, gradually appearing more energetic. This clearly bothered Daniel, whose smile seemed increasingly strained. "That's sweet of you," she said, watching as he unpacked ingredients. "What are you making?" "Beef stew, your favorite, and I brought fresh bread from that bakery you love." Margaret moved around the kitchen, keeping the recording pen in her pocket active as Daniel prepared the meal. She noticed how carefully he measured a white powder into the stew when he thought she wasn't looking. "Would you mind turning down the thermostat?" she asked, giving herself an excuse to leave the room. She texted Jim quickly, "Cooking dinner now. Added unknown substance to stew. Need pick up for testing." When dinner was ready, Daniel served her a large portion. "Eat up, Mom. You need your strength." Margaret took a small bite, holding it in her mouth while reaching for her water. When Daniel glanced away, she spit the stew into her napkin. "Delicious," she commented, "but my appetite isn't what it used to be." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Just a few more bites. For me." Margaret forced herself to appear compliant, pretending to eat small amounts while disposing of most in hidden napkins. Throughout the meal, she noted Daniel watching her with increasingly obvious anticipation. When he finally left, Margaret collected samples of the stew for Jim. The next day, she received his text. Higher concentration of antifreeze than previous samples. Also traces of crushed sleeping pills. He's escalating. That evening, Margaret enacted the next phase of their plan. She called Daniel, her voice deliberately slurred. "Daniel, I don't feel well." She let her words trail off weakly. "Mom, what's wrong?" His voice held an edge of excitement, poorly disguised as concern. "Dizzy. Can't seem to focus. Maybe I should call an ambulance." "No, don't do that. I'll be right over." Margaret hung up and contacted Jim immediately. "He's coming. Get ready." Jim and a trusted colleague positioned themselves in Margaret's guest bedroom closet, recording equipment at the ready. Margaret disheveled herself, splashed water on her face to simulate sweat, and carefully applied makeup to appear ashen. When Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, he found her collapsed in her armchair, breathing shallowly. "Mom." He rushed to her side, checking her pulse. "Can you hear me?" Margaret fluttered her eyelids. "Daniel? Something's wrong." I think I need a hospital." "You'll be fine," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Just rest. I'll take care of everything." "The stew," she mumbled. "I think it was the stew." A flash of alarm crossed Daniel's face. "No, that's impossible. You're confused." He took her hand, his touch gentle despite his intentions. "Just relax. It'll all be over soon." "What will be over?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he stroked her hair in a parody of comfort. "Don't fight it, Mom. Just let go. It won't hurt, I promise." "Why?" she whispered, genuine tears forming in her eyes. "Why would you do this?" For a moment, indecision crossed his face. Then his expression hardened. "I need the money, Mom. I'm in trouble, deep trouble. These people will kill me if I don't pay." "I would have helped you," Margaret said, each word a struggle as she maintained her act. "You don't have what I need. The insurance pays $1 million if you die accidentally. It's the only way out for me." His confession, captured clearly on the recording devices, was damning, but Margaret needed more. "You poisoned me," she stated plainly. Daniel didn't deny it. It was supposed to be painless, like falling asleep. He checked his watch. "It won't be long now." "The water," Margaret murmured. "The orange juice. The soup." "Yes," he admitted, seemingly relieved to unburden himself to his dying mother. "I tried to make it easy, but you kept fighting it somehow." Margaret let her eyes close, her breathing becoming more labored. "I'm so tired now." "That's good," Daniel soothed, squeezing her hand. "Just sleep." As he watched her apparent decline, Daniel began gathering her personal items, methodically emptying her purse, removing her jewelry, checking her pockets. When he found the recording pen, confusion crossed his face briefly before horrified understanding dawned. Before he could react, the closet door burst open. Jim and his colleague emerged, weapons drawn. "Daniel Finch, step away from your mother," Jim commanded. Daniel froze, the recording pen clutched in his hand, the evidence of his confession contained within it. "You set me up," he whispered, staring at Margaret as she straightened in her chair, the illusion of her imminent death evaporating. "You were never sick." "No," Margaret said softly, heartbreaking despite everything. "I was never dying. But I have been sick with grief since the day I found that insurance policy." Daniel's face contorted with rage as Jim approached him with handcuffs. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat at Margaret. "They'll kill me now." "Who will kill you, Daniel?" Jim asked calmly, securing the cuffs around Daniel's wrists. "It doesn't matter," Daniel muttered, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Margaret watched her son, the boy she had raised, loved, sacrificed for, being read his Miranda rights in her living room. The surreal horror of the moment made her dizzy. She gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. "We've got multiple samples of poisoned food and drink," Jim was saying. "Your recorded confession. The forged insurance policy. The case is airtight, son." Daniel stared at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. But when Jim's partner began leading him toward the door, panic flashed across his face. "Wait," he said, turning back to Margaret. "Mom, you don't understand. These people, they're not the kind you can hide from. The money was my only way out." Margaret found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "You could have asked for my help. What could you have done?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "Sell your house. That wouldn't even cover half of what I owe. The life insurance was the only solution." "Your only solution was to murder your mother?" Jim asked incredulously. Daniel's face flushed. "I was desperate. I still am. Mom, please, if you love me, don't let them take me in. Those loan sharks will find me in jail. They'll make an example of me." For a brief moment, Margaret felt a flicker of the maternal instinct that had guided her life, the urge to protect her child at all costs. But then she remembered the dead plant, the forged signature, Daniel watching her sleep, waiting for her to die. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said quietly. "I can't help you anymore." As they led him away, Daniel's composed facade finally cracked. "You'll regret this," he shouted over his shoulder. "When they come looking for their money, they'll come after you next. Is that what you want? You're signing my death warrant, Mom." The door closed behind them, and Margaret was alone with Jim. "He's just trying to manipulate you," Jim said gently. "It's what desperate people do." Margaret nodded numbly. "I know, but what if he's telling the truth about these loan sharks?" "We'll look into it," Jim promised. "But right now, let's focus on the fact that you're safe. We have enough evidence to put Daniel away for a long time." Later that evening, after Jim had gone, Margaret moved mechanically around her house, locking doors and windows. Every shadow seemed threatening now. Every creak of the old house made her jump. She couldn't bear to sleep in her bedroom, where Daniel had stood watching her. Instead, she curled up on the living room sofa with a blanket, her phone clutched in her hand. Sleep eluded her. Images of Daniel as a child kept flashing through her mind. His first day of school, the science fair project they'd worked on together, teaching him to drive in the empty high school parking lot on Sunday mornings. How had that smiling boy become someone capable of such calculated cruelty? 3 days later, Margaret sat in an uncomfortable chair in the police station, watching Daniel through a one-way mirror. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in his orange jumpsuit. His attorney, a public defender with an overflowing case file, spoke to him in low tones. Robert stood beside Margaret, a steadying presence. "You don't have to do this," he reminded her. "They have his confession on tape." "I need to hear it from him," Margaret said firmly. "I need to understand." When she entered the interview room, Daniel's expression remained impassive, but she saw the muscle twitching in his jaw, a tell he'd had since childhood when he was nervous. "Why did you agree to speak with me?" Margaret asked as she sat across from him. Daniel studied her face. "I wanted to see if you really go through with this, sending your only son to prison. You tried to poison me, Daniel. Multiple times." He shrugged, the gesture so casual it chilled her. "It was nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Margaret repeated incredulously. "I'm your mother, and I'm in debt to people who break kneecaps as a warning, who make examples of people who cross them." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what they do to the families of people who can't pay?" Margaret refused to be intimidated. "So instead of coming to me for help, you decided to murder me." "I went through every other option. Believe me." Daniel's voice took on a pleading quality. "The insurance was the only way out that protected both of us." "Protected me? By killing me? It would have been peaceful, dignified, better than what they'll do to you now." Margaret felt a cold anger rising within her. "Is that a threat?" Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a reality. These people know about you. They know where you live. When I don't deliver, they'll come looking for alternatives. The police can protect me." Daniel laughed, the sound hollow and joyless. "For how long? A week? A month? These guys are patient. They'll wait." Margaret studied her son's face, searching for any trace of remorse, any flicker of the boy she'd raised. She found nothing. "The lab tests came back," she said quietly. "The final dose you gave me would have caused excruciating pain before death. That doesn't sound peaceful or dignified." For the first time, Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I was running out of time, getting desperate." "So desperate you were willing to watch me die in agony." Margaret's voice broke. "Your own mother?" "I would have stayed with you," Daniel said, as if that were a consolation. "You wouldn't have been alone." The casual cruelty of his words struck Margaret like a physical blow. This person across from her wasn't her son anymore. Perhaps he never had been, not really. "I've made arrangements to help with your legal fees," she said, rising from her chair. "Beyond that, I can't do anything more for you." Daniel's mask of indifference slipped. "Mom, please, don't walk away. I'm scared." For a moment, Margaret hesitated. Despite everything, the instinct to comfort her child pulled at her. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said finally, "but you stopped being my responsibility when you decided my life was worth less than your debts." As she turned to leave, Daniel called after her. "They'll find you, Mom. When they do, remember you had a chance to help me." Margaret didn't look back. She walked steadily out of the interview room, past the officers and Robert, and straight to the ladies' room where she locked herself in a stall and finally allowed the tears to come. Later, as Robert drove her home, he outlined the legal proceedings ahead. "The evidence is overwhelming. His confession alone would be enough for a conviction. How long will these serve?" Margaret asked, staring out the window at passing houses, each with its own family, its own secrets. With attempted murder, forgery, and the premeditated nature of it all, 10 to 15 years minimum. Margaret nodded silently. It was little comfort. Her son would spend the next decade in prison, and she would spend it looking over her shoulder, wondering if his threats about loan sharks were real or just a final manipulation. At home, Robert helped her check the house before leaving. "The security system is installed," he reminded her, "and Jim has arranged for regular patrols past your house." "Thank you," Margaret said, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "For everything." After Robert left, Margaret stood in her kitchen, the house quiet around her. On the counter sat a glass of water, clean, clear, untainted. Such a simple thing, yet she hesitated before lifting it to her lips. The water tasted sweet and pure. Margaret drank deeply, tears sliding down her face as she realized how long it had been since she trusted something so basic. Over the next 2 months, Margaret's life settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The house felt emptier without the regular visits from Daniel, but also safer. She began sleeping in her own bedroom again, though still with a chair propped against the door handle each night. Daniel's trial progressed quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the district attorney was confident of a conviction. Margaret attended each hearing, sitting silently in the back row, watching her son in his prison uniform. He never turned to look at her. On a crisp autumn morning, Jim stopped by to check on her security system. "How are you holding up?" he asked as they sat at her kitchen table. "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted. "I keep waiting to feel differently, to miss him or forgive him. But I just feel empty." Jim nodded understandingly. "That's normal. You're grieving for the son you thought you had. Have you found anything about those loan sharks Daniel mentioned?" "We've been investigating," Jim said carefully. "Daniel did owe money to some dangerous people, but we've been monitoring them, and there's no indication they're targeting you." "You think he was just trying to manipulate me again?" "Possibly, or exaggerating the threat to gain sympathy." Jim hesitated. "There is something else, though. The district attorney called this morning. Daniel wants to make a deal." Margaret tensed. "What kind of deal?" "He's offering to provide information about his gambling associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. Will they accept it?" "They're considering it. His information could help break up a significant illegal gambling operation. But even with a deal, he's still looking at substantial prison time." Margaret absorbed this news silently. Part of her wanted Daniel to serve every possible year for what he'd done. But another part, a quieter part, was relieved. The sooner he finished his sentence, the sooner she could truly move on. "I have something else to tell you," Jim said, his expression softening. "The life insurance policy has been canceled. The company is investigating the broker who processed it, since they should have verified your signature in person." "That's good," Margaret murmured, though it seemed almost irrelevant now. After Jim left, Margaret sat alone, thinking about the future stretching before her. At 68, she had hoped to spend her remaining years surrounded by family, perhaps eventually grandchildren. Now those dreams seemed foolish. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Robert. "Margaret, I just received a call from the DA's office. Daniel accepted a plea deal this morning. 12 years with possibility of parole after 8. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the news sink in. "Thank you for telling me." "There's more," Robert continued. "Part of his deal includes a full confession, including the names of his gambling contacts. It's going to be dangerous for him in prison. He's essentially turned informant." "I see," Margaret said quietly. Despite everything, she felt a twinge of concern for Daniel's safety. "The DA asked if you'd be willing to make a victim impact statement before sentencing next week." Margaret considered this. What could she possibly say? That her son had broken her heart more thoroughly than she'd thought possible. That she still woke in the night, frightened by every unexpected sound. "I'll think about it," she finally said. The day of Daniel's sentencing arrived with a steady rain that matched Margaret's mood. She dressed carefully in a simple navy dress, applied minimal makeup, and drove herself to the courthouse. The courtroom was nearly empty. A few reporters sat in the front row, but no friends or supporters for either Margaret or Daniel. As she took her seat, Daniel was led in by guards. He looked thinner, his face gaunt. When given the opportunity to address the court, Daniel spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I want to apologize to my mother," he said, staring straight ahead rather than looking at her. "What I did was unforgivable. I convinced myself it was necessity, not malice, that I was protecting her from worse fates. But that was a lie I told myself." He paused. "I hope someday she can find peace, knowing I regret my actions deeply." The judge then turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Finch, would you like to make a statement?" Margaret approached the podium slowly. She had rehearsed what to say, but now, facing her son directly, different words emerged. "My son was once the center of my world," she began, her voice surprisingly strong. "I measured my success as a person by his happiness and achievements. When my husband died, Daniel became my entire family." She paused, gathering herself. "Learning that he saw me as nothing more than a financial solution was the greatest pain I've ever experienced." Daniel flinched visibly but maintained his forward gaze. "I don't wish him additional suffering beyond his sentence," Margaret continued, "but I need the court to understand that he has already given me a kind of life sentence. I will never again trust without question. I will never again drink a glass of water without hesitation. I will never again sleep without fear." She looked directly at Daniel now. "I want my son to use his time in prison to become someone different from the person who could poison his mother. Someone who values human life, including his own, more than money or escape from consequences." Margaret returned to her seat as the judge delivered the agreed-upon sentence. 12 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 8, plus restitution and mandatory counseling. As Daniel was led away, he finally turned to look at Margaret. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement of what had been lost, of what might never be recovered. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat in her living room reading when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman she didn't recognize, perhaps in her early 30s, with Daniel's eyes. Cautiously, Margaret opened the door. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Finch? My name is Elaine Thomas." The woman looked nervous. "I was Daniel's girlfriend about 10 years ago. I think we need to talk." Margaret let her in, maintaining a careful distance as she offered coffee. When they were seated, Elaine spoke hesitantly. "Daniel and I were together for almost 2 years. We even talked about marriage. But he had a gambling problem even then, and when I got pregnant, he panicked." Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. "Pregnant," Elaine nodded. "He wanted me to terminate the pregnancy, said he wasn't ready to be a father. When I refused, he left. I never told him when our daughter was born." She reached into her purse, removing a photograph. "This is Sophie. She's 9 now." Margaret took the photo with trembling hands. The child had Daniel's smile, her own mother's auburn hair. A granddaughter she never knew existed. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked, unable to look away from the photograph. "I saw Daniel's case on the news. Elaine explained. Sophie's been asking questions about her father's family. I thought, maybe if you wanted to meet her. She trailed off uncertainly. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something other than grief or anger stir within her. A spark of hope, fragile but real. I would like that very much, she said softly. 3 days later, Margaret opened her door to find Elaine again, this time with Sophie beside her. The little girl had her hands clasped nervously in front of her, but her eyes, so like Daniel's, held curiosity rather than fear. "Hello, Sophie," Margaret said, kneeling despite her arthritic knees. "I'm your grandmother." Sophie studied her intently before asking, "Do you like chocolate chip cookies? My mom said you might have some." Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. "I do have cookies. Would you like to come in and have some with milk?" As they sat at the kitchen table, Margaret watched Sophie dunk her cookie methodically in her glass of milk. Such a simple, ordinary moment, yet it felt like a miracle. Later, when Sophie was exploring the backyard garden, Elaine spoke quietly. "She doesn't know about Daniel's situation. I've just told her that her father made some mistakes and is away for a while." "That seems appropriate," Margaret agreed. "She's too young to understand." "I was thinking," Elaine said hesitantly, "maybe you could be part of her life regularly. She could use a grandmother." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I would like nothing more." That evening, after Sophie and Elaine had gone, Margaret sat in her garden watching the sunset. The betrayal and pain of Daniel's actions would always be part of her. But now, unexpectedly, she had been given something new, something hopeful. She went inside and poured herself a glass of water. She drank it without hesitation, savoring its clean taste and the simple pleasure of something that could once again be trusted. Tomorrow she would start clearing out the guest room. Paint it perhaps in bright colors Sophie might like. There would be sleepovers, birthdays, holidays to celebrate. A future she had thought lost to her. Daniel had taken much from her, but life, it seemed, was not finished with Margaret Finch just yet.